Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to Japan House London. My name's Sam Thorne, Director General here, and it's a pleasure to be introducing what promises to be a fascinating and, I think, very timely panel discussion titled The Contest for Influence in the Global South. Before introducing our chair and panel, I'll say a few words of introduction about Japan House London. Our mission is to present the very best of Japanese cultures here in the UK. And across 3 floors in this Art Deco building, we have this auditorium, an exhibition space, shop, a restaurant, a library, many other things besides. Since opening in 2018, we've presented exhibitions on subjects as diverse as Ainu, craft and culture, robotics, or I would really encourage you to see our current exhibition, Hyako, that runs until early May and brings together almost 2,000 works in ceramic, leather, glass and wood as well. What we do here is bring together different worlds. We bring together people and ideas from the worlds of culture, innovation, business, and in the case of this evening, policy as well. It's a great pleasure to be hosting this evening's panel discussion. The Global South has, of course, emerged as a critical arena in the competition for global power. As this competition intensifies, our panel of distinguished experts will explore the shifting power dynamics. This evening is open to the public, it is on the record, and it will be later posted on both our website and the website of Chatham House. Our thanks, as ever, to Chatham House for your ongoing partnership. And thank you to Ben Bland for chairing this evening's panel. Ben is let me get this right, Ben, Director of Chatham House.
Director of the Asia Pacific
program. Of the Asia Pacific program.
But thanks for the promotion.
Of course. This is collaboration in action. Thank you, Ben. I'm going to pass over to you now to introduce this panel and this evening's theme. So please join me in welcoming everyone. Thank you.
Welcome everyone who's joining us in person and online as well. My name, as Sam said, is Ben Bland. I'm the Director of the Asia Pacific Programme at Chatham House, the think tank in London, and we're really delighted to be partnering with Japan House London. Again, I think this is the 3rd year we've done an event here in person and quite a few more years before that online, back in the dark days of COVID. We're here today, as Sam said, to talk about the Global South and particularly Japan's relationship with the Global South and this broader competition for influence. So what do we mean when we talk about the Global South? I better get that out of the way. First, we're talking about the diverse group of developing countries that make up the majority of the world's population. These countries in Asia, Africa and Latin America are also the engines of economic growth and population growth, and most, if not all, have had a history of being colonized and exploited. Sam mentioned of changes in the world, and as we know, the US is turning inwards increasingly under the current administration. Our global institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization are breaking down, and we're broadly in an era of dramatic change in international affairs. At this moment, we see China and India, the 2 big rising nations of Asia and the world, trying to present themselves as leaders in their own way of the Global South. And meanwhile, I think the US tends to look at the Global South as an arena for diplomatic and economic competition, primarily with China, but also to a certain extent with Russia. The UK and its European neighbours, meanwhile, are also trying to deepen their relationships across the developing world as we try and diversify away from economic links with China. When it comes to Japan's approach to the Global South, I think it's always been a little bit different. It doesn't have the deep pockets that China has, and it can't offer the security guarantees that the US used to offer to other parts of the world. But what Japan does have is a long track record of development assistance and a reputation for actually building things, ports, airports, roads, bridges. It also perhaps carries less historical baggage than some of its European partners, not necessarily in all parts of Asia, but certainly in other parts of the world. And we're going to be talking today about what Japan is trying to achieve in its relationships with the Global South, whether and how Japan can scale up particularly as it faces its own domestic political challenges? And more broadly, how do countries in the Global South perceive these different approaches from Japan, China, Europe, the US? And what role will countries of the Global South play in reshaping our global order at this time of flux? With the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer currently on his way to Beijing and then Tokyo, it's a really great time to be talking about these questions. I think the whole EU Commission is also in India this week trying to agree, and I think they have agreed a really big trade deal. So to get some answers to some of these questions, I'm joined by a really great panel. Firstly, to my left, we have Professor Ken Jimbo, who's flown all the way from Tokyo to be with us today. He's a professor at the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University and a former advisor to different parts of the Japanese government. Next to Ken is Rebecca Nadin. She's Director of Global Risks and Resilience at ODI Global, which is a development-focused think tank in London. And she's also a former British diplomat in Beijing, which is great to have that perspective on China. And last but not least, we have my colleague Kshitij Bajpai, who's Senior Research Fellow for South Asia in the Asia Programme at Chatham House. Sam's already mentioned the ground rules. It's on the record. The event is being recorded. I'm going to throw some questions at the panelists for about 35 or 40 minutes. And then importantly, we want to hear questions from you in the room and online. If you're on Zoom, please ask your questions using the Q&A function. If you're in the room, I'll come to you later. So put your hands up later on when it's time. And at the end, for those who are in person, we're going to have a drinks reception next door, which should be hopefully an even more fun part of the evening. Right, at this point, let's crack on with the subject matter at hand. And I'm going to come to you first, Ken, while you're still awake, having come all the way from Tokyo. I want to get a sense of Japan's perspective on the Global South and why Japan is seeking to deepen its relationships with the developing world and what Japan wants to achieve from this push.
Well, thank you very much, and I'd like to begin by thanking Japan House, beautiful place, for organizing this event, and also Ben from Chatham House, organizing the whole setting of this discussion, and glad to see both houses are collaborating with each other. Those of you who have a skeptic viewpoint about the concept of the Global South, and those who even think that these concepts ever existed, you are all legitimate. But let's think this is like a glowing kind of political framework in approaching to the new dynamics what we are seeing, because the long concept of the South itself has been transcended from the very stagnant kind of economic scheme that's now, because of the dynamic changing of the global balance of power, South is now dynamically growing, and they have a meaning voices in the international relationship. But also South is somewhat very frustrated in a way that their voices are not properly represented proportionally to their strength in the global politics, where that post-war global regimes and norms and institutions are not really giving them kind of proper voices to be heard in the politics. And they sometimes connotate their own kind of ideological agenda for sometimes sounds like anti-Western and anti-ideological kind of delivery into this. So in that context, that Japan felt that kind of the category of the global scheme, especially recently after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it's, we regard this as the clear violation of the international legal norms and also the UN Charter, so that the world needs to get together to counter against the Russian invasion, to bring back the norms to be taking place. So when you look at the kind of all the UN, voting processes, and more than 140 countries, voted against the norms. But when it comes to the joining the economic sanction, you can only find initially like 37, 8 countries sign up for those regime. But why they are not really joining into the global sanction scheme, because they do have pros and cons about the rationality they take on the economic and political relationship on that issues, and sometimes connotate with why do we have to join in that sanction while there are so many diversity of the the viewpoints on this time. And then Japan found that place that this is some kind of notion of the global South country who has been taking the pros and cons on these agenda to be delivered in a very kind of different approaches, not just like expanding the kind of G7 norms to the world affairs, but not really bringing the ideology into agenda. But Japan should be the independent actor to frame that the global South needs to have a different schemes to be engaged. And then, as you mentioned, that Japan has a long history of engaging in the development of the emerging economies through the ODAs and different schemes, and such types of accumulated experience and also the history may have its own foundation and platform to engage in this very different dynamics. So I think that as you mentioned, that Japan may have not the deep pockets in the delivering the kind of those the funds to the infrastructure developments, but in terms of the longer term development processes, we actually valued in the quality investment structures, where in the longer run they will have the greater gains in the development. So that is the kind of long-term kind of engagement in the development fields is one of the kind of asset that we are now proposing. And secondly, we are also not really bringing in the conditionality and the ideology into the process of the developments. So when you look at, for example, new plan for free and open Indo-Pacific concept, where former Prime Minister Kishida has delivered in the 2023 in India, it is all about the concept of the inclusiveness in a way that Japan will be there to help side by side with different agendas of the developing nations may want, and then we wish to bring in those kind of scheme to actually work together for the future of the developments. And after all, they will entail in the connectivity projects, which may create the better conditions for the business environment for many. And thirdly, I think that Japan also place an importance on the institution building and capacity building on the scheme. So it is not about giving money from the donor to recipient relationship, but also creating a kind of infrastructure, and that is also be essential for the development. So it is a kind of the scheme that we are providing as a model for development. It is not the kind of, we are not claiming the copyrights on this issue, but let everybody to join in as a processes for like what Indo-Pacific is not a Japanese concept. It's a concept for everybody. And this is how we try to reach out to the global South, and I hope that this delivers as a very effective way in engaging those category of the politics.
And just to push you on one point, I mean, you started by talking about the divisions in the world that the Russian invasion of Ukraine showed, where many countries in the global South were not strongly against the invasion necessarily. But you said Japan doesn't put conditions, but does Japan hope that through these kind of economic assistance over time you can bring people into your sort of geopolitical camp? Is there a geopolitical agenda behind this?
Well, I think that the Japanese approach, as I mentioned, is a kind of medium and longer run, gains rather than expected to have a short-term gains in perspective. But I think, looking at the kind of different aims, but the approach seems to be quite different. With a belief that I guess that Japan is thinking about model where I think that the rules and the institutions and also those kind of long-term commitment may create a better path for achieving that kind of the goal that we have, so that rather than bringing in the kind of quite unified format of the conditionality for the countries like like India, Pakistan, and also in Southeast Asia, and that is more conducive for the the mutual benefits will be perceived, and then that you can actually bring in those kind of economic benefits and also the private sector, capacity into the field, where you can really have the much more better condition for the proposal that we have in the later stage, what kind of rules and norms and institutions to be built. And so these are the kind of the condition building rather than the institution setting from the early stage.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up. Rebecca, I want to come to you next to get a perspective on how China sees sort of its engagement in this broader sort of competition for influence in the Global South. I mean, obviously, it's long positioned itself as a leader of the Global South, but in the last 10 or 20 years, we've really seen huge financial efforts to put money behind that. So what's China trying to achieve, and how has its approach sort of changed in the last year or so with all the dynamic changes we've seen in global politics?
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Ben, and delighted to be here this evening at Japan House. So I think when we think about China's relationship with the Global South, or the global majority, because if you think about it, there's a lot more people who live in the Global South than they do in the North. So from China's perspective, the relationship with the Global South has evolved as China's own stages of nation-state building has evolved. So in the 1950s, so we see at the 1955 Bandung Conference, you have Zhou Enlai going there, participating in the conference. This is at a stage when Mao Zedong, when they were still focused on the revolutionary stage of nation building, so overthrowing the bourgeois, overthrowing the capitalist running dogs and fighting the communist revolution. And for China, relations with its neighbours, relations with the Global South has always been very core to what China calls its periphery diplomacy. And this is deeply rooted in China's definition of national security. And it's important to understand that how China defines national security is not just in terms of hard traditional security or security alliances, but this is very wide-ranging. This includes energy security, food security, cultural security, ideological security, economic security. So from the Chinese perspective, the Global South in the early 50s was very much about ensuring that revolution, that ideological purity, but then it starts to evolve as China's own stages of national nation building evolves. And it's important to remember at the height of the Great Leap Forward, when millions of Chinese people were starving due to policies enacted by the party, China was still providing aid. It was still sending food to Vietnam, for example. So we then have in the 1970s this move when Deng Xiaoping goes to the UN and starts to articulate the three worlds theory. And this three worlds theory, this is really framed how China sees the world. So you have the superpowers, and China still obviously pays great attention obviously to that relationship with the US. How do you manage the superpower relations? And then you have the second world, the Global South, and then the third world. But China all the time is positioning itself as central to that developing world. And then we start to see in the 2000s, the sort of 1980s, starts to transform what China calls its South-South cooperation. So it's not really using the term Global South at this point. So it's moving from this ideological solidarity on like the non-aligned movement and so on, to this absolute focus on economic integration. So technical cooperation agreements start to develop. Also, it's very important to note, you'll hear, China's engagement with the Global South starts with the BRI. Absolutely not.
That's the Belt and Road Initiative.
Sorry, the Belt and Road Initiative. Sorry. No, China's engagement and its outward investments absolutely are starting really, from the 60s, 70s. Xi Jinping they give it just a really nice, catchy name, the Belt and Road, but fundamentally that outward investment has been happening for a long time. And then of course China joins WTO. So in in 2001. So then we start to see this development with least developed countries, so this focus on market access, because all the time China is considering its own domestic position. So the Belt and Road Initiative, where it's trying to expand these external markets, is to deal with a fundamental domestic problem of supply side reform, because they've got overcapacity in a number of key sectors. It's about developing new consumers. So then we have also this shift then to the engagement, which is around, as Ben alluded to, the investment. So we're seeing much more investment going out. The state-owned enterprises are backed by the Chinese policy banks. There's not too much concern really about the kind of credit issues, but then this starts to change, and this has changed really quite significantly in the past few years, because Xi Jinping, there's this real push, as I mentioned. What does national security consider? It also considers financial security, and that's the stabilization of the financial system in China. So really the lending is starting to go down, and then we see a prioritization as well around certain supply chains, all linked to what China domestically, what its economy is focused on. So rare earths, obviously, food security, but then also this big push on Chinese EV, which has been a point of contention for Europe as well, but really seeing those markets really opening up. But fundamentally, as I said, China is really still holding on to this developing country narrative. And this is very important, because having this developing country status is important how China negotiates, for example, in the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework on Combating Climate Change, in other international treaties. So China is, for China, the engagement with the Global South, it's about standing with the Global South, but it's also about shaping it. It's about ensuring fundamentally that it is a China first policy, and this is actually where the US and China, share kind of that same outlook. So China is seeking to shape it on terms that protect its own security, its own resilience, and now increasingly, and will be interesting as we see the 15th five-year plan roll out, its technological edge.
And Kshitij, how do you see this? I mean, what do you think is driving this competition? I mean, obviously, as both Ken and Rebecca have alluded to, this for Japan and China, it's partly about their own economic drive to find new markets and new consumers. But are there other sort of geopolitical factors at play that are driving this intensifying competition for influence?
Well, I mean, look at this from if I'm looking at this from India's perspective, first of all, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be back at Japan House. I think Japan is seen as a welcome development partner in the Global South. Historically, I think it's offered a more, I would say, transparent and maybe sustainable model of development to China's development assistance. More emphasis on quality infrastructure, quality growth. Although I think China itself has embraced this, and increasingly in its development assistance, particularly given the blowback to the so-called debt trap diplomacy narrative. But looking at this from the perspective of the region that I work on, South Asia. I mean, India has been a leading recipient of Japan's ODA, Official Development Assistance. Japan has been involved in several infrastructure and development initiatives in India, including places like India's Northeast and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. The reason I mention that is these are extremely geopolitically sensitive parts of the country. And the fact that India has welcomed development assistance and investment from Japan is significant. It shows how important that the relationship that India values, and it's unlikely to accept similar development assistance from other countries, particularly China, and beyond India as well. In Bangladesh, Japan is financing the first deepwater port development project, the Matabari Port Development Project near Cox's Bazar. So I think Japan is, of course, seen as I said, a key development partner in South Asia. But interestingly, beyond that, what we see increasingly is Japan working together with so-called like-minded countries on development initiatives in the Global South. Just last year, India and Japan, they concluded this joint vision for the next decade last August. And as part of that, they concluded a cooperative initiative for sustainable economic development in Africa, which essentially entails that India is serving as a hub for Japanese private sector investment in not only South Asia, but the broader global South. That being said, I think there is a bit of a gap between the rhetoric and the reality. And an example that comes to mind here is the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which was an initiative which was launched back in 2017 between India and Japan. Many had framed it as some sort of alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative, but it really hasn't, you haven't really seen it pan out. It has failed to gain traction. What I would say is this is, of course, not an issue which is confined to Japan. We've seen several countries announce development initiatives in recent years. There's the European Union's Global Gateway, there's the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, and others. And what we've seen is, as countries have looked increasingly inward, have been facing growing fiscal pressure, they've pulled back on a lot of their overseas development assistance. The U.S. cutting back on, the Trump administration cutting back on USAID is, of course, a good example of that. So, in that context, I wouldn't see Japan's development assistance as necessarily an alternative to China, but perhaps a supplement to China. So I wouldn't put it in such maybe confrontational or competitive terms.
But on that point of competition, Ken, we obviously know that right now Japan-China relations are in a difficult place, but they typically have been in a difficult place most of the time for the last few decades. How far is this competition with China element driving Japan's outreach in the global South? I guess particularly in Asia, where we have often seen Japan and China going head to head, for example, in trying to get a contract to build high-speed rail in Indonesia. It's one good example, which China won in that case. So how far is this really about competing with your big neighbor with whom you have such a difficult relationship?
Right. I think that we have several layers when we talk about the Japan-China competition on the development fields and the engagement with the global South. And the one layer you can find is unexpectedly, that's how we collaborate on each other. And that was symbolized by the late Prime Minister Abe's visit in 2018 to Beijing, where we actually came up with a lot of so-called win-win types of the solution into the development fields. And during that time that the Japanese government tried to encourage Chinese engagement in the global South to be much more transparent, to ensure the kind of long-term fiscal kind of sustainability should be the perspective that Japan wished to promote. At the same time, like environment, labor, and those standards needs to be respected. And then in that context, that Chinese investment scheme like Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Japanese led initiatives like ADB can actually have a co-finance projects in somewhere in Pakistan and other areas. At the same time that we are also developing the scheme called the Third Party Market Corporation, where Japan and China can jointly kind of finance some of those kind of projects in Southeast Asia and beyond. And that was a kind of scheme that you can find the kind of net enormous demand for the infrastructures in developing Asia that Japan and China can actually have net kind of positive results. Why don't we kind of collaborate on the scheme? And that was sometime that we actually had the moment of creating such kind of strategic development coordination in Asia, which many of those kind of Asian recipients really appreciated, because you don't have to take sides between Japan and China on that field. But those development schemes actually encountered a lot of problems in there, because of how China engaged in the infrastructure projects are very much different from the style we have on Japan, because it is very much on the kind of public-private partnership scheme that Japan is engaging, and the private sector has to be responsible for the stakeholders and all kind of the conflict of interest and all kind of management, where China actually spends a lot of money through much more in the strategic lens, so that many of the collaboration scheme didn't work out, unfortunately, in the early 2000s, and with all the COVID has altered all the kind of coordination processes even further. And remaining thing is much more on the competition side as you expect. And especially on the way that we are now promoting is something that we call it like a Japanese style of engagement, which ensure that we will try to impress that there will be a long-term gain by actually joining the scheme of what Japan is proposing. Vis-a-vis Chinese kind of, the huge kind of, disperse of the finance, which may have a lot of kind of problems. Of course, they have a lot of kind of schemes that it is adhered to many of those recipient demands, but at the same time, those kind of a scheme that it's been introduced as like a debt trap kind of scheme, and then which kind of scheme to be reciprocated by the demands of those recipients are the kind of thing that Japan is now trying to be built on, so that you can find so many kind of infrastructure projects that is very much under the scope of the competitive lens between Japan and China. But the net result that we are now receiving from many parts of the region is that you cannot really want that those kind of scheme to be under the lens of the competition between two sides, so that you are now dragged into the kind of great power competition through accepting those kind of schemes, so that those are a lot of like uncomfortableness that were provided to those the recipient regions.
And Rebecca, for China, I mean, how far is it sort of intensification of its linkages with the Global South driven by competition, I guess, much more with the US, and this sort of sense of the US trying to contain China, China needing alternative markets, and also, I guess, wanting to maybe capitalize on some of the current frustrations with the US administration in lots of the world?
I think it's important to note that the primary driver of engagement with the Global South is China domestic needs. So this is about the Chinese economy. This is about what China needs in order to achieve, for example, China has this 2049 goal where it seeks to have by 2049 a modernized socialist state with a world-class military. So how China is engaging is, of course, the US is a consideration when it comes to next gen or fourth, fifth industrial revolution tech. So if we're talking about access to rare earths, if we're talking about the development of technology. So for example, China has invested heavily in Africa. So it's invested heavily in terms of, yes, historically some of these big infrastructure projects, but now what we're seeing is lots of joint ventures. We're seeing a lot of change in how China is, the contracts are being developed and what the focus is. So we've seen a huge uptake in investment in digital infrastructure, in satellite internet communication systems across Africa, launching of satellite constellations, etc., providing to African countries, for example, Huawei's obviously there, but also subscription to internet satellite comms. And I think what we do have to remember, I mean, the debt trap diplomacy narrative was very strong in the kind of pre-2010s, but China's peak lending was in 2010, and then it starts to go down. And it's also really important to remember when we're talking about China's investment or any other country's investment, whether it's the EU or whoever, that the countries that they are engaging with have agency. So how the countries negotiate, whether it's with the EU, whether it's with the US, whether it's with China, Japan or whoever, that they have agency. And we did quite a bit of work, for example, in Cambodia, where at the national level, the Cambodian government had brought in international lawyers to negotiate with the Chinese. And actually, the results there were far more positive. Not so good at the provincial level in some areas, but certainly at that national level. And it's really important to remember that Chinese companies are winning these contracts on competitiveness, they're winning them on timescales, because for many of these countries that they're engaging in, the political elites themselves, it's not about the Chinese necessarily have gone in and you've had elite capture where there's lots of bribing and corruption going on. It's because these governments are dealing with very short election cycles. So in a democracy, which many of these countries are, for example, you've got 5 years to build that hospital, 5 years to build that road. They can't wait for the EU to take 10 years to go through its very laborious contracting processes and approve it, and all the bureaucrats in the EU signing it all off and so on. So we've got to think about the conditions and the agency that the countries themselves have.
Yeah, that's a good point. Kshitij, I want to come to you and ask you a bit about India, which often sort of presents itself as well, sometimes implicitly in competition with China, as a sort of putative leader of the global south. But has India been able to put much meat on the bones of this leadership? I mean, it's clear from what Rebecca was saying, and obviously looking at the data and the fact that China's done a lot, Japan in its own way has too. What about India? What do India's ambitions amount to?
Well, I would say, yeah, the rhetoric outweighs the reality to some degree, and the progress has been patchy. I mean, of course, India's ambitions to lead the global south are not new. It can be traced back to the Cold War, India's efforts to offer so-called third world solidarity through movements like the Bandung Conference, the non-aligned movement. But I think, India has always sought to have a seat at key rule-making institutions, whether it be its never-ending quest for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, its G20 presidency in 2023, it's hosting the BRICS summit this year. It wants to host the COP climate change conference in 2028. And in doing so, India wants to be a so-called voice of the global south. That's what the term that it uses. We saw this very much in action during its G20 presidency when it facilitated the entry of the African Union into the G20. But I think how India seeks to distinguish itself from, say, China is, and other countries, is to offer perhaps a more benign worldview, which is non-Western, but not explicitly anti-Western. It wants to be a reformist rather than a revisionist power. It promotes itself as a so-called bridging power, a bridge between the West and the rest. I think we're likely to see this in action this year when India hosts the BRICS summit. It's likely to downplay some of the more controversial elements of the BRICS narrative, de-dollarization, for instance, which has incurred the wrath of the Trump administration, perhaps seeking a degree of alignment between India's chairmanship of the BRICS and the United States chairmanship of G20. But beyond this rhetoric, substantively, I think India has been very active in areas like its contribution to UN peacekeeping operations, vaccine distribution efforts in the global south at the height of the COVID pandemic, digital public infrastructure, encouraging what's referred to as digital inclusion or the democratization of technology. I think these are areas where India has been more active, and then there are other areas where it's been less active. And one area which comes to mind, particularly in the current geopolitical context, is conflict resolution. Whether it be the conflict in Gaza or closer to home, instabilities in India's own neighborhood in Afghanistan or Myanmar, India has been far less forthcoming, perhaps in providing assistance. I think that speaks partially to material constraints that India is facing. It lacks the economic heft that China has. Its economy is 1/5 the size of China's. And I think there's also ideological constraints. India's long-standing commitment to strategic autonomy in its foreign policy, which means maintaining good relations with all poles of influence in the international system. So it wants to be on good terms with both Iran and Israel in the context of the conflict in the Middle East. It wants to be on good terms with both Russia and the US in the context of the war in Ukraine. So I think that these are some of the factors which sort of hold India back from playing a more prominent role in being this so-called voice of the global south.
And talking about domestic constraints, Ken, I want to come to you and ask about some of Japan's domestic challenges, because Japan, I guess, like the UK and lots of places, has been through a lot of political turmoil. I think 4 prime ministers in 5 years and an election coming up next month with a lot of uncertainty. I mean, how much does that turnover in domestic politics affect Japan's ability to sort of present a consistent, clear offer to the global south, and to be honest, in general terms in foreign policy? Does the domestic instability impact Japan's effectiveness on the global stage, or is the Japanese bureaucracy and parliament able to just, ride through all that instability?
Yeah, I did not necessarily portray that the Japanese politics in flux or turmoil at this stage, because, for example, Prime Minister Abe, stayed there for 7 years and 8 months. It's an unprecedented kind of longevity of the Japanese politics, and comparing with, it's like a revolving door system that we experienced in the past. And they actually created the platform of the global engagement through the free and open Indo-Pacific policy, establishing a lot of like a legal platform on the security affairs, and also their engagement in the international institutions. And I think that, those kind of the prime minister who actually took over the case, like Suga and Kishida, Ishiba, and current Ms. Takaichi, are basically inheriting those kind of capitals and assets that Abe administration has created. So that I think there has been a lot of like consistency and continuity over Japanese basic policy on this field, and no kind of prime minister has denied the basic course of action that they are taking. Of course, there's a detail. There are so many changes that has been taking place, and I think that really comes from the international structure that really limits and constrains Japanese course of action to be taken. For example, now that global order, rule-based international order, liberal international orders are now being heavily challenged by United States and many of the transactional politics that has been taking place. But after all that, Japan, together with the UK, living in the world where markets and economic connectivity really creates the condition for our national survival. So in that case, that the rule-based international order is based on our national interest. So we've got to sustain that order, whatever it takes in the international transactional politics that has been taking place. So that this is a place where Japanese basic policy remains to be at stake. But at the same time, that we have to be very flexible and responsible to the current the world politics has been taking place. If the United States will be looking inward by forging the America First policy as a basic agenda to be taken, the Japan, unlike the India, where Japan is basically the major ally in Asia, we don't really pursue the Plan B processes, whatever that strategic autonomy, the concept of might take place. Our role is to induce United States as a resident power in Indo-Pacific, and connecting those America First agenda and in the alliance management is essentially the important agenda for us, so that America First could be much more accelerated through the engagement in the alliance. It's something that I think we are now promoting to have. And look at the recent U.S.-America, U.S.-Japan agreements. And there's a lot of things about the supply chain management, helping the Americans' production capacity on the steel and shipbuildings and those on. And that has been the baseline of how United States require the Japanese capacity to promote the United States concept moving forward. So this is, I think, what takes place in Asia, especially together with Korea and Australia. We have a very kind of similar dynamics, where that the Plan B is not necessarily the kind of viable option in Asia. So this is the kind of the structural kind of constraints that we have in Asia.
And what do you think for the UK, Rebecca? Should the UK be sort of leaning in to try and sort of keep the US close, or should the UK be thinking more about developing our own kind of hedging relationships in the global south, with China even, maybe obviously with the Prime Minister there this week? How do you think the UK should be approaching this kind of dynamic?
Yeah. Just before I answer that question, I want to just make one point about the rules-based international order. Yes, obviously Donald Trump has really thrown a kind of fox in the hen house, I suppose. But let's be clear, though, the rules-based international order and how that is perceived depends very much on where you are sitting in the world. So China and Russia and a number of other countries have been very vocal for many years, decades, about the need to reform the rules-based international order. You know, from the non-aligned movement, etc. If we take China's perspective, so China started in the Mao era, as I discussed, in the 50s, 60s. You know, it was very much disengaged. It was isolationist. Then in the early 70s, it starts to participate, and it starts to participate in the international rules-based system. It participates in international architecture like the UN. It participates in WTO, etc. So it's starting to participate in this. But then we see actually from Jiang Zemin period, so the early 80s, 90s, then into Hu Jintao, and then with Xi Jinping, this very reforming focus. So Donald Trump has been very vocal, and he's saying all the things that we don't expect a Western, worldview president to say. But actually, they're talking about reforming the rules-based international order because they've decided that that doesn't suit America. And the Chinese and the Russians have been saying this for years, that actually this rules-based international order is completely skewed. And from the Chinese, that goes back to the early 19th century, where they learned very much actually from the Japanese and from the British and the European powers how international law could be used to subjugate, from the Chinese perspective, the treaty ports, the so on, the legation and all of the quarters, etc. That really this understanding that actually lawfare could be used against them. So I just wanted to make that point, that it depends where you sit on the world, whether you feel that the changes to the international rules-based order is a nightmare or is actually something that you've been agitating for.
And yeah, I'm going to come to questions in the audience in a second. But yeah, what's your sort of perspective then on the UK? Should the UK be maybe doing a Japan, leaning in to keep America close, or should we be thinking we should diversify, we should particularly look at the Global South and different partners where we don't necessarily see eye to eye as maybe we have with others in the past?
Yeah, I think it depends what we're talking about, what we see eye to eye on. And I think this is obviously where China has, I suppose, had the advantage. So China, I think we talked about this a little bit early on in the talk, China, when it's engaging with different countries, is talking about development. It is talking about socio-economic development. So it is not putting these conditionalities on of human rights, of net zero, etc. So I'm not making a judgment call on that. I'm just saying this is what it's been doing. So the UK historically had lots of different ties, so through the Commonwealth, through with lots of bilateral relationships, but it stepped back for many years from lots of different countries. It had very strong relationships with many countries in the Global South, but through economics, through changes in approach, etc., it's decided to step back. I mean, let's face it, we're a pretty small country, so we're going to have to play, I suppose, how many middle powers are starting to think about things. We had a meeting yesterday at ODI with a delegation from the Uzbekistan embassy. And they were saying, I mean, if you think where Uzbekistan is, where that's between two massive superpowers, you're Russia and China, and they were saying, look, we don't want to be in strategic competition, but we also want to remain sovereign, but they're really grappling with how they do that. And this is many questions that Prime Minister Starmer's going to have to, we can't turn our backs on the US because of security, of trade, etc. The government argues a lot, Chinese investment in the UK is really, really important, but it's tiny. It's like 0.7% or something, but the number of Chinese students is significant. So yeah, who'd be a politician?
Okay, on that happy note, your turn to ask your questions. Please make sure it's a question, not a statement, and tell us your name and any affiliation if you have one. So yeah, just put your hands up and then please wait for the mic to come to you. So yeah, who wants to jump in first? Yeah, at the front. Oh, just wait for the mic. Just down here, sorry, at the front.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm Bianca from the Global Governance and Security Center at Chatham House. My question is, sorry, like very specifically directed towards Professor Ken, but also I'd love to hear perspectives from everyone else. You said that Japan sees the US as the resident power in the Pacific, but given their sort of look inward, it's becoming obvious that they're not exactly a reliable security partner. So particularly in terms of security cooperation, where do you see Japan going and looking for those partnerships so there's a more sustainable peace in the region? And to the other panelists, where do you see China and India making those security partnerships and leaning away from the US at a time where they're not the most reliable? Thank you.
May I start? Thank you for the question, especially that in this year, 2026, is a year that Japan will embark on the review of the major strategic documents, where you can expect that there will be a higher target for the defense spending, and the variety of new sets of the procurements will be, I think, will be placed as an important agenda to be taken. And I think that we are aiming at three strategic goals. And number one is to how much we can actually increase our defense capacity in order to make our capability for escalation control by our own capability might be possible, which is to expand our concept of the defense in terms of the geographical engagement and capability-wise, and the much more indigenous kind of command and control and kill chain systems, and how much we can really deal with that conflict surrounding Japan is the one. And the second, as I mentioned, during the conversation, that U.S.-Japan alliance remains to be essential in defense of Japan and security of Asia. And as you mentioned, that at the time that the United States intentions to provide forces during the conflict seemingly much more flux, but we remain to be committed to the so-called deterrence by denial concept, where you can maintain that capability, which may be enough to deny the Chinese prospect of the operational success in changing the status quo by force. And those are, I think, essential component to not to open the window of the opportunity for the Chinese leaders to take that kind of belligerent actions in the case for Taiwan and other cases, and how much we can really maintain that capability will be essential. And the final part is to expand the cooperation of the like-minded states like Korea, Australia, Philippines, Singapore, and other partners, and how much that those kind of capability could be collectively make those kind of resilient capability for any kind of coercive actions taken by those actors. So that, of course, those needs to be interacted with each other. But I think the remaining essential part is how much you can really induce the United States to be part of the region.
So if I can push you a bit there, how worried are you about the US commitment to Japan? If 10 is the most worried and 0 is not worried at all, where are you on the sort of worryometer?
6.5.
6.5. Very exact answer. Kshitij, it's interesting to think about the security offer as well. I mean, for India, is there a security offer? I mean, it makes lots of its neighbors feel insecure a lot of the time, but is there a kind of global Indian security offer beyond the UN operations?
I think, just echoing what was said, I think there is a real push in working with so-called like-minded countries. So, for instance, last year on the sidelines of the G20 summit, we saw this Australia, Canada, India technology and innovation partnership, which was announced. Today, we saw the India-EU summit take place. There's a lot of emphasis on the trade deal, but there's also the so-called mother of all trade deals. But there's also a defense and security partnership. So I think there is this real push towards working with like-minded countries, and India's sort of ambition in doing so is to preserve its strategic autonomy in a world of renewed great power competition, but also great power assertiveness. So I think that is sort of India's push, and I think it sees certain key partners in that context. So Israel, France, for instance, the European Union as a whole. And actually, in principle, also the United States. India conducted more joint military exercises with the United States last year than any other country. That's despite the downturn in India-US relations. So I would say India, the US still remains a key strategic partner for India, and I think the relationship remains sticky to some degree, despite the negative rhetoric and the bad blood in the relationship at present.
And Rebecca, China has a global security initiative alongside its development and civilization and governance initiatives. I mean, what's China trying to achieve? Is it trying to be some sort of alternative security guarantor or peacemaker in the world to the US, or does it have something different in mind?
Yeah, I don't think China's at the stage yet where it's going to be committing troops, although its legislation on the National Defence Law does allow now for Chinese troops to be deployed in defence of strategic national assets, and they can be outside of China. So I think it's important to note that China only has one military alliance, and that's with North Korea. It has lots of security, what it calls security partnerships, but this tends to be a lot of joint military exercises, particularly with the STANs, the Central Asian states, also with countries such as Thailand and others, South Africa and so on. So within that BRICS format, Russia, of course. And a lot of the exchanges under these security partnerships is around exchanges of law enforcement. So bearing in mind as well from the Chinese perspective that the People's Armed Police and also the Coast Guard, etc., are all seen as part of the PLA of the Chinese military. I mean, absolutely, China is very much focused on, as Ken says, area access denial. So to explain, this is about denying, and this is from the US perspective. China, I think there's a bit of wait and see. Donald Trump's been not quite as clear as other US presidents on Indo-Pacific. Is the US going to maintain itself as an Indo-Pacific power? China definitely doesn't want Russia to have any aspirations there, and it's quite happy that it's focused in Europe. But for China, the main security is of course Taiwan. But for China, it's North Korea. It does not want to see a nuclearized, weaponized North Korea. This would be a disaster for China. Afghanistan. The rest of the world's forgotten a bit about Afghanistan, but China definitely hasn't, and of course India as well. But China still has a number of unresolved border issues as well. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Next question. Who wants to go? I think we had one there, the gentleman in the blue shirt and suit.
Bob Savick with GPI and GIS. I'd just like to raise the issue of secondary sanctions and secondary tariffs. For the Global South, this is a huge issue. The US, the UK and the EU apply over 3/4 of unilateral sanctions globally. And secondary sanctions and secondary tariffs are primarily targeted at the Global South. Individuals, businesses, countries, India subject to 50% tariffs by the US, Brazil 50%, and so on and so forth. So Japan is the exception. Interestingly, it doesn't apply secondary sanctions as far as I'm aware, but all the others do. So how does the West hope to gain long-term influence in the Global South when it keeps ramping up these horrific penalties economically and otherwise on the Global South? Thank you.
Who wants to go first?
Well, I would say, from an Indian perspective, half of the 50% tariffs that have been slapped on India are coming from India's purchase of Russian crude. India historically, I think, has been far more responsive to Western sanctions. So we saw India suspend its purchase of, or significantly drop its purchase of Iranian crude after the US terminated the JCPOA, that's the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. It's dropped its purchase of Venezuelan crude after sanctions were imposed on Venezuela. And most recently, it's dropped its purchase of Russian crude oil. It was from a peak of about 40%. It's dropped to about 25% of its total imports in December in response to these sanctions that were secondary sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft. So I think India, compared to other countries in the global south, if you want to look at, say China or others, has been far more responsive to Western sanctions. But I think this is what has driven this whole de-dollarization narrative that we see within forums like the BRICS, this push to settle bilateral trade in their own currencies, to reduce their exposure to the Western financial system. But I would say, this is very much a work in progress. I don't think this is something which is going to happen overnight, but that is the direction of travel.
And do you think, Ken, for Japan, is it a risk that if you try and stay too close to the US, you just look like another part of the Western system trying to impose all those rules on the rest of the world that they were unhappy about in the first place? Do you need to try and differentiate Japan's approach from the US a bit more?
Well, I think that we are exercising. What I mentioned about the importance of the United States is exactly in the terms of the distribution of power in Indo-Pacific, especially in countering the Chinese influence. Definitely that has to be offset by the United States. And if you compare that context with Europe vis-a-vis Russia, the defense spending, quota, but all the kind of European states really exceeds that of Russia. Of course, you have a lot of perspective on all the force size and nuclear weapons and all kind of things. But if you combine like Asian defense spending vis-a-vis China, you cannot really compare the kind of asymmetrical differences. And that is very much a different kind of condition that we have in Asia vis-a-vis Europe. That is one place. But I think in terms of how Japan tried to see that the rest of the world engagement, we are not bringing in the U.S. flag whenever we try to, place the kind of development schemes in that scheme. We wish to be very much independent in that part, and then how much we can be successful in the global south can be the asset to be bring back to the alliance. And this is, I think, at the new alliance model, we are not trying to bring in all the kind of US-Japan alliance project in there, but I think alliance can be much more strengthened in the way that the allies can play its indispensable role in other place.
I think we've got time for maybe a couple more, if we have any more. Maybe here at the front.
Ellie Price. I'm also from Chatham House, but I'm interning in the Africa program. So my question is about Africa, and Professor. Can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. For Professor Ken, but also everyone else on the board, I was wondering about the level of public consciousness in Japan. I think, obviously, its history, like China's history with Africa, Europe, and the UK's history with Africa is different, and as you mentioned, the historical links are kind of not necessarily there. And to what extent do you think that's a hindrance to whether it's aid, development, investment? I understand that private companies, are making a lot of effort, as you mentioned, but do you think that there needs to be a kind of reimagination within the Japanese public to what position it should have in the kind of new order?
Right, and I think that history plays the huge role in the post-war politics and its engagement in the world in Japan because of the reflection of the Japanese role after the war. Plays a huge, I think, at both incentives and also constraints in imagining our roles, especially vis-a-vis Asia and so. But with a kind of growing confidence and also historical kind of compilation of how we engage has been brought back in the where Japan can really identify so-called the Japan model to be, to be reflected. And when you see those kind of public surveys, especially in Southeast Asia, Japan plays in a very high ranking in terms of the affinity rates and who are the favorite countries, where is the favorite destination place for the holidays, and Japan comes into very much in the good picture, and we really take advantage and capitalize those in terms of the promoting the Japan model to create the favorable environment where both sides can really play both business and also the very kind of confident relationship with each other. So that the public image has been becoming much more confident in facing with the world, and Japan is accepted in a much more in the public consciousness, and that is much more reflected in the public mindsets. But at the same time, because of the internal problem, aging populations, and then growing disparities and all kind of social program creates Japan to be much more inward. So we are no exception from the world kind of trends that we are now dealing with, and the rising kind of a notion of the weak yen really prevents those kind of younger generation to go abroad. So these are the, I think, emerging public psyche that we are currently facing.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, maybe one at the back. Just right at the back, yeah.
Hi. Hello. Hi. So I'm a student at King's College London and also part of the Chatham House Common Futures Conversations programme. So I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more about those next-gen technology, specifically related to climate technology, mitigation, adaptation, and obviously China is a big leader, especially in terms of solar, and so I was just wondering if Japan kind of sees itself as trying to compete in that area, if China considers any competition coming from anywhere else because it is so dominant. And I just wondered if you could speak a bit about that. Thank you.
Do you want to give a view first, Rebecca, and then I'll come to Ken just so you can have a breather?
Yeah. China doesn't really see too much. I mean, I suppose on wind, the Dutch, but I mean, China's just invested, as we know, so heavily in that, and the low-cost EV cars. Also, I mean, China's investing huge amounts in battery technology. I don't think it's sort of too worried, really.
Okay, Ken, does Japan have some kind of counter offers here on climate?
Right. I think that that really relates with the emergence of the economic security concept in Japan, where we identify where the indispensable technology lies in the Japanese, both the public and civilian sectors, and try to cultivate, to internalize those kind of production dynamics, and then to create as an indispensable place in the interdependent kind of production system they have, and then to try to really avoid the over-reliance on China on the whole kind of supply chain mechanisms, and that is important essence for the economic security promotion law that we are now conducting. But in the overall sense that, as Becca mentioned, that it's on the commodity side, Japanese production really lacks the price and production competitiveness vis-a-vis China, and then on the emerging kind of fields like AI, quantum, and biotech. When you look at the ASPE kind of research and all the kind of things, that all kind of the doctoral dissertation and research and the patents data are now being dominated by China and the United States. And the Japanese, I think, figure is much lower than this. So that I think we are now systemically trying to identify where our strength lies in the emerging tech fields. Of course, we do have a very much skillful, production capacity. So why not that? Let's try to kind of jointly design and all kind of new products together with like-minded countries like India, Israel, United States, and to be produced in Japan to scale up the production and to be delivered in the world kind of market. Those are something that Japan is now trying to rebrand ourselves in the global market.
Because I think on robotics as well, Japan, I think the Chinese still see, Japan as a sort of competitor.
I
in that
doubt
space.
that.
Yeah.
You saw the video of the Honda's Asimo type of things. I like that, like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But now that the Chinese robotics are so great,
Yeah.
and they are actually, it's a combat proven in terms of productions, automations, and all kind of autonomy projects are now going on. If you go to Shenzhen, it's a future city. And it's
absolutely. I think they're definitely on energy security. So I was talking more, China's not so worried on the commercial, on the commodities side. But as Ken said, same with Japan, the energy security is still a driver.
All right, I think on that note, we are out of time for now. So thanks everyone for joining us. Before we wrap up, just a reminder for everyone in the room that we are going to have a drinks reception outside. So if you hadn't had a chance to ask your question yet, you can ask it directly to any of the panel or myself afterwards, which should be great fun. Thanks again to everyone from Japan House who supported this. Thanks to my colleague Chloe as well for making everything happen. And thanks to you all and to our panelists for a really great discussion.